Why is it important for me to read in English? This is a question that my friends usually ask me. They think I attend classes, do my homework, and watch movies in English. So why should I bother reading books? Well, allow me to explain why reading is the most effective way to improve your English skills. First, reading is extremely essential. In the past, only 1 in 4 people pursued higher education. But nowadays, more people are going to college. Consequently, all careers require a greater focus on reading and writing than in the past. This applies to anyone, whether you're an office worker or a technician. Secondly, reading has a significant effect on improving your speaking, writing, vocabulary, and grammar more than any other technique. While it may not directly improve your listening skills, it does broaden your vocabulary. With an English repertoire, you will be able to listen more easily and thus improve your listening comprehension. During your years of study, you probably came across a lot of boring textbooks and short stories, accompanied by English exercises. However, I am not referring to those. I am referring to reading for pleasure. That means reading a book simply because you like it. You're not reading because your teacher asked you to or because you feel you should. You're reading it because you really want to. In a survey carried out in schools in the United States, some boys were given free books, such as James Bond stories. They were told they could do whatever they wanted. They were not required to read. However, they read the books. In fact, they read a substantial amount of books. Some even finished a book every 2 days. After a few years, these students were evaluated. Those who received the books showed a great improvement in their reading and writing skills and also came to enjoy the school more. On the other hand, students who did not receive the books did not demonstrate improvements in their skills, and some even regressed. This phenomenon is not limited to native English speakers. A similar experiment was conducted with English learners in Fiji. 3 teaching methods were tested: the traditional teaching of English, with grammar classes and exercises, silent reading in the classroom, and reading together with the teacher. After a year, the 2 methods that included reading proved to be the most effective, outperforming students who took traditional English classes. The experiment was repeated in Singapore, and the results were similar. Students who practiced silent reading performed remarkably, especially on grammar tests. In contrast, those who focused on grammar classes scored worse on the tests. In conventional classes, we tend to focus on memorizing grammar rules and word lists. However, when reading, we absorb these components naturally. Maybe you're thinking that reading in English is complicated for you. I have to consult the dictionary all the time. It's boring and I can't. I understand your concern. That's exactly why I wrote this book. I believe that it will make reading something enjoyable for you, because the stories are light and fun. The first stories are short and easy, while the last ones become more extensive and challenging. When you're done, you'll think, wow, I did it. I also created a podcast called Simple Spoken English Practice. 9 of the stories in this book were originally created for the podcast. One of the stories was written exclusively for this book. However, in compiling the book, I made some improvements to the narratives. You can now read these stories at beginner, pre-intermediate, intermediate, or advanced levels. They are all fairy tales. Some are well known, others not so much. I even wrote one of the short stories. You might think fairy tales are kids' stuff. I need to learn practical vocabulary. I need to study topics like business and science. That doesn't mean it can't be fun. In fact, the vocabulary in these stories is extremely useful. McQuillan conducted a study where he examined the vocabulary present in novels. He found that 8% of the words were on lists of academic vocabulary, which are necessary for university studies. Rogers also conducted an experiment. He investigated whether reading 1 million words of science fiction would help students acquire essential scientific terms for their courses. The answer was a resounding yes. Therefore, fairy tales can also be fruitful for you. However, I understand if you still have questions. When I heard about all this, I also found it hard to believe. But I'm always willing to try new things, and I'm passionate about learning languages. In 2017, I decided to do an experiment. I always wanted to learn Spanish, but I hadn't advanced much in traditional classes. So I challenged myself. I'm going to read 1,000,000 words in Spanish. Then I'll evaluate my progress. Reading 1,000,000 words is the equivalent of reading about 40 books, so it was a big goal. I started with easier material, like this book. Later, I started reading translations of books I had already read in English, such as Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. Finally, I started reading new books in Spanish. I explored the works of Latin American writers, such as Isabel Allende, Jorge Luis Borges, and Manuel Puig. I really liked your texts. I also listened to podcasts, but I always read the transcripts and added words to my vocabulary. After reaching my goal of reading 1,000,000 words, I started talking to native Spanish speakers. I found that I had reached an intermediate level. I could understand almost everything I read, capture clear conversations, and maintain dialogues. My focus was mainly on reading and not so much on speaking. In 1 year, I learned more than most students learn in 2. I didn't memorize grammar rules or vocabulary lists. I learned them spontaneously. You may be thinking, I can't believe that, or, wow, I'm going to read several hours a day. However, I need to highlight something fundamental. You should read books that are easy and enjoyable. If a book is too complex or boring, put it aside and look for another one. Stephen Krashen, a language learning expert, recommends reading only English materials that are enjoyable and engaging. Read content that is really simple, which you wouldn't read in your native language because it's too easy. Thus, you can read comics, magazines, mystery novels, among others. Don't feel guilty about reading translations. When you read very easy books, you will understand the meaning of unknown words without having to resort to a dictionary. Now you may be wondering, what exactly would be an easy text? I suggest that you understand at least 98% of the words in a text. I know that 98% seems like a high number. However, let me give you an example. Imagine a text in which 50% of the words do not make sense. In this case, you would only understand 50% of the words. Jerry ran out of bed and opened the curtains. He blamed himself while making breakfast. He made coffee and put butter on his puffer. Someone called his phone and he answered. Was very surprised by who was tingling, so his inky fell to the ground. It's so easy to understand. You could read an entire book written this way. Now, let's consider the same text, but this time only 2% of the words are meaningless. In this scenario, you would understand 98% of the words. Jerry jumped out of bed and opened the curtains. He sang to himself while making breakfast. He made coffee and buttered his toast. Someone called his phone and he answered. He was very surprised by who was calling, so his inky fell to the ground. How was it? You may not have understood everything, but it was more enjoyable to read compared to the first text. So, if you wish to read more, you can also listen to my podcast, English Listening Practice. I release a new story every week, complete with audio and text. There are over 100 episodes for you to enjoy. We can improve our English skills through captivating stories. Let's listen to one of these stories. Undoubtedly, this will improve your English speaking skills like never before. You want to improve your English, want to speak English more fluently. You see, the English language has transformed my life. I was born in Hong Kong, so English is not my first language. My first language is Cantonese, my second language is Mandarin because my mother is from Taiwan, and my third language is English. When I immigrated to North America, I couldn't speak a word of English. I'm aware that some of my fans watch my videos to learn how to speak English, which I find quite interesting. Therefore, today I would like to share with you 5 steps to improve your fluency in English. These are the steps I personally followed to learn the English language. The number 1 step to improving your English fluency is actually very simple. Don't worry about it. That's right, don't worry about it. Speak when you want, where and how you can. It doesn't matter if you have an accent. I still have an accent and communicate with tens of millions of people every month. irrespective of, don't worry about how others will judge you or what they will think of you. None of this matters. Just talk as much as you can. If someone doesn't understand, repeat it. If they still don't understand, repeat again. Keep talking. Step number 2 is immersion. When I was learning English, I immersed myself in the language. I listened to songs in English every day and tried to sing along with the songs. It was a challenge. At first, I tried to listen to rap, but it was very difficult for me. However, I watched English movies without subtitles and listened carefully. Initially, I didn't understand much, maybe only 5% of the dialogue. But as my English improved, I realized that I could understand the film more and more. So immerse yourself in English, speak in English, listen to English music, and watch movies in English. Participate in these activities as much as possible. Naturally, you will learn slang, stories, and phrases. This is how you learn a language. The third step is to make it enjoyable. Learning English doesn't have to be a chore. Interact and connect with English-speaking people. Read, watch, and listen to content in English. That's how you improve. That's how I improved. Step number 4 is continuous immersion. When I was learning English, I immersed myself in the language. I listened to songs in English every day and tried to sing along with the songs. It was a challenge. At first, I tried to listen to rap, but it was very difficult for me. However, I watched English movies without subtitles and listened carefully. Initially, I didn't understand much, maybe only 5% of the dialogue, but as my English improved, I realized that I could understand the film more and more. So immerse yourself in English, speak in English, listen to English music, and watch movies in English. Engage in these activities as much as possible. Naturally, you'll pick up slang, stories, and phrases. This is how you learn a language. Step number 5 is to surround yourself with English speakers. I know this may seem obvious, but this is how you do it. I remember when I was in college, I noticed that Chinese students only hung out with other Chinese students, Korean students with Korean students, and Japanese students with Japanese students. I did the opposite. I looked for English speakers to pass the time. I hung out with Caucasians and individuals who grew up speaking fluent English. We engaged in conversations and activities together. We would go to the library, and I would make an effort to talk as much as possible, listen carefully, and ask questions to feel more comfortable. Another thing I did was date an English-speaking Korean girlfriend. This was another way to immerse myself in the language. I'm not saying it's the only way to learn, but if you want to learn a new language, spend time with people who speak that language. You'll be amazed at how quickly you can learn it. Let me give you a bonus tip, an additional step if you're interested. Step number 6 is to outdo yourself. Allow me to explain. If you are aiming to learn a language and you are currently at a certain level, the fastest way to progress to the next level is to surpass yourself. Let's use a fitness analogy. If you want to strengthen your biceps, let's say you currently lift a hypothetical 20-pound weight. If you want to make those 20 pounds easier to lift, how do you train? You train with 25-pound or 30-pound weights. This is surpassing yourself. The same principle applies to language learning. Stay in a state of overlearning. For example, in my case, I didn't just focus on learning the English language, but also on learning how to close deals and do marketing. I didn't limit myself to everyday communication. I looked for something deeper, where money was involved. That's how I became fluent in English. I'm sure you've experienced moments in your language learning journey where you felt like you were making rapid progress. Everything seemed easy and you were motivated. However, at some point, you hit a plateau and felt like you would never speak fluently, confidently, and in a natural way. You're not alone. This feeling of being trapped is often referred to as the intermediate plateau. I experienced it myself. It can be a comfortable place to be. You can communicate and understand many situations, but for most of us, it's not enough. We want to enjoy the language as easily as we enjoy our native language. I've never had the experience of learning English as a second language, so I'd like to introduce you to an expert who has done it successfully here at Real Life English. You may have heard me on our podcast. However, today, I would like to share a little bit of my story and how I went from zero English to the level of proficiency I have today. Just like you, I am an English learner, and I had to learn English from scratch in my home country of Brazil. I've never lived abroad, so I'm going to share with you how I do it and hopefully provide you with some inspiration and ideas for your own journey in English. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell because we release videos every week to help you speak English confidently and naturally. Now, let's get started. My journey in English started when I was 15 years old. As I mentioned earlier, I am from Brazil, and at that time I had no knowledge of the English language. I couldn't speak, read, or write in English. However, at the age of 15, something magical happened. I developed a strong desire to become bilingual. I don't know exactly why, but the idea of using two languages to communicate and express myself was incredibly appealing to me. I also noticed that none of my family, friends, or social circle knew English. This realization led me to associate knowledge of English with having a better life and more opportunities. I enrolled in an English course which proved to be very useful. I also had a friend who took the same course and he kindly lent me his old books. Each semester his school changed the books, so he lent me the ones he no longer needed. That's how I started my journey in English. I studied with those old books and a grammar book he lent me. I studied alone with these books and I remember being fascinated. The English language had always intrigued me, but now I was actively studying. I read passages from the books, copied phrases I saw, and was already excited because I was using another language to write, communicate, and express myself. However, my speaking skills were still very poor. I still couldn't speak, even though I had grown up watching movies and listening to music in English. My speaking skills were not yet developed. I remember trying to read passages aloud from the books I was studying, and it was a disaster. The words didn't flow, and I had no idea how to pronounce certain words. For example, I struggled to pronounce some out loud, but I persisted because that's all I did for about 3 years. From the age of 15 to 18, most of my time was spent studying with books. That was my first mistake. I'm sharing this with you because it took me a long time to start talking. You don't want to make the same mistake. I remember a funny incident. I was at the cash register talking to an American customer, a lady. I was trying to talk to her in English and explained that I had never been abroad. However, she interrupted me and said, "Oh, I guess you mean overseas." I replied, "Oh, overseas. Thanks for the correction." I thanked him. And this is just one example of how these interactions with customers have helped me. Sometimes I would say something incorrectly, and the person would gently correct me. I had a lot of these little interactions, and they were really valuable. Here's a tip I can offer. Be open to correction. If someone corrects your pronunciation or the way you use a word, that's a good thing. I spent 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, talking to Americans on the phone for a year. In a way, it was my version of living abroad. It was my version of participating in an exchange program because I had been talking to native English speakers daily for a year. This experience greatly improved my speaking and listening skills. However, it is important to note that I only got this job because I already had a sufficient level of English. All the years I spent studying and working paid off because they allowed me to secure this job, which in turn improved my English skills even more. So my advice to you is, keep learning, develop, and actively seek job opportunities that allow you to use English on a daily basis. This will undoubtedly further enhance your language skills. During the periods between assignments, I took it upon myself to create my own English immersion experience. Now that I was using English in my daily work routine, I got even more serious about it. Everything I did revolved around English. I watched movies, TV series, and listened to music in English. I'm particularly into rock and roll, so I always listened to my favorite bands in English. With my first paychecks, I would go to media stores to buy DVDs and CDs. By the way, if you're interested in learning about my exact step-by-step process for improving my English through movies and TV series, let us know in the comments. Maybe I can create another video in the future explaining how I did it. Lastly, there was a peculiar event in my life that significantly propelled my English proficiency to the next level, and that was to become an English teacher. I started teaching English at the age of 21, and it's been about 14 or 15 years since then. I have to say that teaching English and helping others with English was an experience that really elevated my mastery of the language. When you teach, it's like you're learning it all over again. When I have to teach a class or help someone, I have to prepare, study the topic, familiarize myself with it, think of different ways to explain concepts and provide examples. This mental process helps me understand the topic better, so I can explain it effectively to my students. It's a win-win situation. When you teach someone, you benefit by revisiting and studying the information, and the other person benefits by learning new things from you. So, these are the steps and experiences that helped me improve my fluency in English. I hope they inspire you and provide you with ideas for your own English journey. Remember that learning a language is a lifelong process, and it's important to enjoy the journey along the way. Keep practicing, immerse yourself in the language, and push your limits. You will be surprised.